May 1933. Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. The testing facility smelled of machine oil and saltwater corrosion and the distinctive bitter odor of pure oxygen under high pressure, where engineer Captain Toshihide Asakuma stood before a torpedo that his American counterparts had dismissed as theoretical impossibility, as engineering fantasy that violated fundamental principles of chemistry and physics, as a weapon system so impractical that attempting to build it represented waste of resources that could be better spent on conventional torpedoes that actually worked rather than experimental designs that existed only in the overactive imaginations of engineers who understood mathematics but not operational reality. The torpedo was 24 inches in diameter and 9 meters long, weighed 2,700 kilograms fully loaded, and was powered by a propulsion system that every American naval engineer who had examined the concept declared impossible to implement safely, impossible to make reliable, impossible to deploy operationally because the physics were too unforgiving and the margin for error was too narrow and the consequences of malfunction were too catastrophic. The propulsion system used pure oxygen combustion, burning kerosene in pure oxygen rather than in air, generating thrust that was 3 times more efficient than conventional compressed air torpedoes, allowing the weapon to travel 40 kilometers at 48 knots or 20 kilometers at 52 knots, ranges and speeds that seemed impossible to American engineers who understood that pure oxygen systems were inherently unstable, prone to spontaneous combustion, liable to explode during handling or launch or while running, too dangerous to deploy on warships where a single accident could destroy the launching vessel along with the torpedo. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. Asakuma was 42 years old, a naval engineer who had studied at Tokyo Imperial University and who had spent 15 years designing torpedo systems, who had become obsessed with the oxygen torpedo concept after calculating that conventional compressed air torpedoes were fundamentally limited by the nitrogen in air, which contributed nothing to combustion, but which consumed storage volume and added weight, making it physically impossible to achieve the range and speed necessary to engage targets at the distances where modern naval battles would occur. Air was 78% nitrogen and only 21% oxygen, meaning that conventional torpedoes wasted nearly 80% of their oxidizer storage volume on inert gas that was ballast rather than fuel, that contributed nothing except limiting performance to ranges of perhaps 6 kilometers at moderate speeds, ranges that required launching ships to approach dangerously close to targets before firing, ranges that made torpedo attacks high-risk operations with low probability of success because targets could maneuver away from torpedoes whose slow speeds and limited ranges gave defenders time to evade. Pure oxygen combustion eliminated the nitrogen problem, allowed torpedoes to carry only the gas that actually participated in combustion, allowed 3 times more energy storage in the same volume, allowed ranges and speeds that transformed torpedo attacks from desperation tactics into viable offensive weapons that could engage targets at ranges where the launching ship remained relatively safe from return fire. But pure oxygen was viciously reactive, would combust with almost any organic material, would ignite lubricants and gasket materials, and even metal components if conditions were right, would turn minor malfunctions into catastrophic explosions that could destroy ships and kill crew members who happened to be near the weapon when something went wrong. American engineers studying the oxygen torpedo concept in the late 1920s had concluded it was too dangerous to pursue, had calculated that the safety requirements would make the system too complex and unreliable for operational use, had decided that incremental improvements to conventional compressed air torpedoes represented better investment than revolutionary but risky oxygen systems. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance had issued a formal assessment in 1931 stating, "Pure oxygen torpedo propulsion offers theoretical performance advantages, but practical disadvantages eliminate it from serious consideration. The safety risks are unacceptable for shipboard operations. The system complexity would create maintenance burdens that forward-deployed units could not support. The incremental performance improvement does not justify the exponential increase in operational risk. Recommend continuing development of advanced compressed air torpedoes rather than pursuing oxygen systems that are unlikely to achieve reliable operation under combat conditions." This assessment had been shared with Japanese naval attachés through the routine technical exchange that occurred between Allied navies during the period when Japan and the United States maintained cordial relations, had been presented as friendly advice from experienced American engineers to their Japanese colleagues who were apparently considering oxygen torpedoes, had been delivered with the subtle condescension that characterized American technical interactions with Asian nations in the 1930s, when Western engineers assumed that Asian technical capabilities were inferior and that advice from American experts would be gratefully received and promptly followed by nations whose industrial development lagged behind Western standards. Asakuma had read the American assessment and had reached exactly the opposite conclusion, had decided that American caution represented opportunity rather than wisdom, had understood that if the United States would not develop oxygen torpedoes because of safety concerns, then Japan could achieve significant tactical advantage by solving the safety problems that Americans had declared unsolvable, could deploy weapons that American doctrine assumed did not exist, could exploit the tactical surprise that would result when American ships encountered torpedoes with performance characteristics that exceeded anything their commanders believed possible. The technical challenges were exactly as severe as American engineers had warned, perhaps more severe, because the Americans hadn't fully appreciated how difficult it would be to prevent spontaneous combustion in systems where pure oxygen at high pressure contacted mechanical components that experienced vibration and temperature variation, and where that created conditions where ignition could occur without warning. Asakuma's development program had experienced 14 catastrophic failures during testing between 1928 and 1932, 14 explosions that destroyed test torpedoes and damaged facilities and killed 3 technicians and injured 12 others, 14 reminders that pure oxygen didn't forgive mistakes, and that the margin between controlled combustion and uncontrolled detonation was measured in fractions of seconds and tiny variations in pressure and temperature. But each failure had provided data, had revealed mechanisms by which ignition occurred, had allowed iterative refinement of materials and procedures and safety systems that gradually reduced failure rates from inevitable to occasional to rare to acceptably infrequent. By May 1933, the Type 93 torpedo had achieved reliability that Asakuma considered adequate for operational deployment, had completed 50 consecutive test runs without catastrophic failure, had demonstrated that proper procedures and careful maintenance could manage the oxygen hazard to levels comparable to other naval weapons that also carried significant risks, but which were accepted because their tactical value justified operational caution. The torpedo sitting on the test stand represented the culmination of 5 years of development work and 14 million yen of expenditure and 3 lives lost and hundreds of incremental improvements that had transformed a theoretical concept into actual hardware that worked. It looked conventional to casual observation, just another large torpedo that differed from standard weapons only in details that weren't visible externally. Details like the oxygen flask that stored compressed pure oxygen at 135 atmospheres pressure. Details like the combustion chamber that burned kerosene in oxygen-rich environment while preventing the combustion from propagating back into the oxygen storage system. Details like the exhaust system that minimized visible wake by dissolving combustion products in seawater rather than venting them as bubbles that created tracks enemy lookouts could detect. The final test before operational approval involved firing the torpedo at maximum range against a target sled positioned 40 kilometers away in Hiroshima Bay, a distance that no American torpedo could reach, a distance that represented tactical revolution if the weapon actually functioned as designed, because 40-kilometer torpedo range would allow Japanese destroyers and cruisers to launch attacks from distances where enemy ships couldn't effectively return fire with guns or torpedoes, would create engagement envelopes that favored Japanese forces that possessed long-range weapons against American forces that would discover their doctrine and equipment were optimized for battles that would never occur because Japanese commanders would dictate engagement ranges that exploited the Type 93's capabilities. Asakuma stood in the control bunker and watched through binoculars as the torpedo launched at 1420 hours, watched it accelerate to 48 knots in a clean white wake that marked its path across the calm water, watched it track straight toward the distant target that was barely visible at the horizon, watched the chronometer count seconds that stretched into minutes as the torpedo consumed the enormous distance at speeds that conventional weapons couldn't sustain, watched until 21 minutes after launch when the target sled exploded in a geyser of water and debris that confirmed impact, confirmed that the oxygen torpedo worked exactly as calculated, confirmed that Japan had achieved the technical capability that American engineers had declared impossible, and that American naval commanders assumed did not exist. The operational deployment began in late 1933. Type 93 torpedoes issued to destroyer squadrons and cruiser divisions with strict handling protocols that emphasized the oxygen danger, that required specialized training for torpedo crews, that established maintenance procedures designed to prevent the spontaneous combustion that could destroy a ship if pure oxygen contacted organic contaminants in the torpedo's mechanisms. American naval intelligence observed the deployment through routine monitoring of Japanese naval activities, but assessed that the new torpedoes were conventional weapons, perhaps marginally improved over previous Japanese designs, but fundamentally similar in performance and capabilities, certainly not representing revolutionary advance that would require revision of American tactical doctrine or concern among commanders who planned operations in the Pacific, where Japanese and American fleets would eventually confront each other when diplomatic relations collapsed and war began. The assessment was catastrophically wrong, but it was entirely reasonable given the information available to American analysts who knew that Japan possessed sophisticated naval industries, but who assumed that Japanese engineering capabilities were inferior to American standards, who understood that pure oxygen torpedoes were theoretically possible but practically improbable, who had no evidence that Japan had solved the safety problems that American engineers had deemed unsolvable, who made the comfortable assumption that if American experts declared something impossible, then Japanese engineers certainly couldn't achieve it regardless of their efforts. This assumption, this comfortable certainty that Japanese technical capabilities were inferior, was reinforced by American technical interactions with Japanese engineers who visited American facilities during the 1930s, when relations remained cordial and technical exchanges occurred routinely between navies that were not yet enemies. American engineers showing Japanese visitors around torpedo testing facilities would explain why oxygen torpedoes were impractical, would describe the safety challenges, would emphasize that American engineers had studied the concept thoroughly and had concluded it was too risky for operational use, would offer friendly advice that Japan should focus on improving conventional designs rather than pursuing exotic systems that probably wouldn't work reliably. The Japanese visitors would listen politely, would take notes, would ask technical questions that seemed naive or unsophisticated to American engineers who interpreted the questions as confirming that Japanese understanding of advanced weapon systems was limited, who left these interactions confident that American technical superiority was secure, who reported to their superiors that Japanese engineering capabilities posed no significant threat to American naval dominance, who contributed to the institutional complacency that would prove nearly fatal when American forces finally encountered the Type 93 in combat and discovered that their assumptions about Japanese capabilities were dangerously wrong. The first combat use of the Type 93 occurred in August 1942 during the Battle of Savo Island, a night engagement near Guadalcanal where Japanese cruisers surprised an American and Australian task force guarding the Marine Corps landing beaches, where Japanese commanders exploited the Type 93's long range to launch torpedoes from distances where American ships didn't suspect torpedo attack was possible, where American lookouts were searching for surface contacts at ranges appropriate for gun combat rather than monitoring for torpedo wakes at extreme distances. The engagement began at 1:43 hours on August 9, 1942, when the Japanese cruiser Chokai launched 8 Type 93 torpedoes from 18,000 meters range, distance so extreme that American doctrine didn't include defensive procedures for torpedo attacks from beyond visual range, distance that American commanders assumed was safe from torpedo threat because conventional weapons couldn't reach that far, distance where American ships continued their patrol patterns without evasive maneuvers because their doctrine didn't recognize that they were already under attack by weapons whose performance exceeded anything their training had prepared them to counter. The torpedoes ran for 8 minutes at 48 knots, crossing 18 kilometers of ocean while American ships remained unaware they were being engaged, running clean wakes that night lookouts didn't detect because they weren't searching at sufficient distance, approaching target ships whose crews had no warning until torpedoes began striking hulls at 1:51 hours, with devastating effects that reflected the Type 93's massive 490-kilogram warhead containing more explosive than 2 conventional torpedoes combined, warhead designed to break ships' keels with single hits rather than requiring multiple impacts to achieve mission kills. The cruiser USS Quincy was hit by 2 Type 93 torpedoes simultaneously at 1:52 hours, the impacts occurring 15 seconds apart, striking amidships and forward, the explosions so powerful that the ship's hull was torn open across 30 meters of length, flooding the forward engineering spaces and cutting electrical power that darkened the ship and silenced the radios and prevented damage control coordination, leaving the crew fighting fires and flooding in darkness while not fully understanding what had happened, because the torpedo impacts had been so sudden and so devastating that many crew members thought the ship had been hit by submarine torpedoes rather than by surface-launched weapons from the Japanese cruisers that were still 18,000 meters away and just beginning to close for gun engagement. USS Vincennes was hit by 1 Type 93 at 1:53 hours, the torpedo striking the starboard side below the waterline near the forward magazine, the explosion detonating the magazine's ammunition storage and blowing the bow off the ship in a catastrophic secondary explosion that killed 300 sailors instantly and sent the cruiser settling by the head while survivors abandoned ship in the darkness, knowing that rescue would be difficult because other American ships were under attack and couldn't stop to pick up swimmers. USS Astoria was hit by 2 Type 93 torpedoes at 1:54 hours, both impacts occurring on the port side near the engine rooms, the explosions destroying the propulsion systems and breaking the ship's back, leaving the cruiser dead in the water and on fire while Japanese cruisers closed to gun range and began systematic destruction of the defenseless American ship with 8-inch naval rifles that pounded the burning hull until it rolled over and sank at 0:52 hours, taking 330 sailors with it, including the captain who remained on the bridge and went down with his ship following naval tradition, while probably wondering how his cruiser had been torpedoed from distances where he hadn't believed torpedo attack was possible. The Australian cruiser HMS Canberra was hit by two Type 93 torpedoes at Aero 148 hours. Actually, the first ship struck during the engagement, the torpedoes hitting before American ships were struck, because Canberra was leading the patrol line and therefore closest to the Japanese launch position. The impacts destroyed Canberra's engine rooms and started uncontrollable fires, while Japanese cruisers closed and added gunfire that killed 84 sailors and left the ship burning and sinking, eventually scuttled by American destroyers the following morning, when it became clear the cruiser couldn't be saved, and that attempting to tow it would expose the towing ships to Japanese air attack during daylight hours. The entire engagement lasted 32 minutes from first torpedo launch to the moment when Japanese cruisers broke off and withdrew to avoid being caught by American carrier aircraft at dawn, 32 minutes during which Japanese forces sank 4 Allied cruisers and damaged 2 others while suffering 0 losses, 32 minutes that represented the most catastrophic defeat in U.S. Navy history, measured by ships lost in single engagement. 32 minutes during which the Type 93 torpedo demonstrated capabilities that shocked American commanders who had assumed Japanese torpedo technology was inferior to American standards. The shock was profound and multi-layered. Shock at the tactical surprise of being torpedoed from extreme range. Shock at the devastating power of warheads that destroyed cruisers with single hits. Shock at the realization that American assumptions about Japanese capabilities were fundamentally wrong. Shock at the strategic implication that if Japanese torpedoes were this superior, then other Japanese weapon systems might also exceed American expectations. Shock at the uncomfortable recognition that racism and cultural arrogance had contributed to intelligence failure that left American forces unprepared for weapons they should have anticipated if analysts had taken Japanese engineering seriously, instead of dismissing it as inferior copy of Western technology. The after-action analysis conducted by U.S. Navy intelligence officers examining the Savo Island disaster initially refused to believe that Japanese torpedoes could have been responsible for the damage, initially theorized that the cruisers had been sunk by submarine torpedoes rather than by surface-launched weapons, initially couldn't accept that surface ships had launched torpedoes from 18,000 meters because that range was impossible for any torpedo system that American engineers believed could exist. Only after examining debris recovered from the sunken cruisers, after interviewing survivors who had seen torpedo wakes approaching from extreme distance, after intercepting Japanese radio communications describing the torpedo launches, did American analysts reluctantly accept that Japan had deployed torpedoes with performance that exceeded American weapons by factors of 3 in range and 2 in warhead size. One American intelligence assessment from September 1942 stated with language suggesting genuine shock, "Analysis of Savo Island engagement indicates Japanese forces employed torpedo systems with capabilities significantly exceeding previous estimates. Observed ranges of 18,000 meters are 3 times the maximum range of U.S. torpedoes. Observed warhead effects suggest explosive content of approximately 500 kilograms, double the U.S. standard. These performance characteristics indicate Japanese torpedo technology is not inferior to American standards, but actually superior in critical metrics. Previous assessments underestimated Japanese engineering capabilities. Recommend immediate revision of tactical doctrine to account for long-range torpedo threat that was not previously considered significant factor in surface engagements." This assessment's careful bureaucratic language concealed profound institutional embarrassment that American engineers and intelligence analysts had dismissed Japanese capabilities as inferior, that American commanders had planned operations based on assumptions that Japanese weapons were second-rate, that American sailors had died because their doctrine didn't account for threats that seemed impossible based on American technical standards, but which Japanese engineers had actually achieved through competent engineering and willingness to accept risks that American conservatism had rejected. The shock rippled through American naval commands as additional reports confirmed the Type 93's capabilities. As more encounters demonstrated that Japanese destroyers and cruisers could launch devastating torpedo attacks from ranges where American ships assumed they were safe. As casualty lists accumulated from engagements where American forces were surprised by weapons whose performance characteristics violated American expectations about what Japanese engineering could accomplish. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded amphibious forces in the Solomon Islands and who had lost 4 cruisers at Savo Island, wrote in his official report, "The Japanese torpedo demonstrated in this engagement represents weapon system superior to any in the U.S. inventory. Its range allows attacks from distances where American ships cannot effectively respond. Its warhead destroys cruisers with single hits. Our previous assessments of Japanese technical capabilities were dangerously wrong. We must either develop equivalent weapons or develop tactics that account for Japanese torpedo superiority in any surface engagement. Current doctrine is inadequate against an enemy whose weapons exceed our assumptions about what they could build." This assessment from a senior flag officer represented admission that the comfortable assumption of American technical superiority was false, that Japanese engineers had achieved capabilities that American experts had declared impossible, that the mockery of Japanese torpedo technology as inferior had been wrong and deadly, that hundreds of American sailors had died because institutional arrogance had prevented realistic assessment of enemy capabilities. The Type 93 continued devastating American forces through 1942 and 1943, sinking the cruisers USS Chicago and USS Helena in subsequent engagements, damaging numerous other vessels, forcing American commanders to adopt defensive tactics that sacrificed initiative to avoid Japanese torpedo attacks, creating tactical conditions where American numerical superiority was partially negated by Japanese technical advantages that allowed smaller forces to achieve disproportionate results. The Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942 provided another demonstration of Type 93 capabilities, when 8 Japanese destroyers engaged 5 American cruisers in night action off Guadalcanal. When Japanese destroyers launched 32 Type 93 torpedoes from extreme range before American cruisers could close to effective gun range, when 4 American cruisers were hit and 1 was sunk while Japanese forces escaped with minimal damage, when American commanders were again shocked by torpedo attacks from ranges they still couldn't quite believe were possible, despite previous experiences. The engagement unfolded with brutal efficiency that showcased the Type 93's tactical advantages, Japanese destroyers detecting American cruisers at 23,000 meters using superior optical equipment, maneuvering to optimal firing positions while remaining outside American radar detection range because the destroyers' smaller profiles generated weaker radar returns than American operators could distinguish from sea clutter, launching coordinated torpedo spreads at 23:16 hours from 18,000 meters, while American cruisers were still searching for surface contacts, the torpedoes running silent and wakeless through the darkness, while American lookouts scanned empty ocean, unaware that 32 weapons were converging on their formation. The cruiser USS Northampton was struck by 2 Type 93 torpedoes at 2320 hours, both impacts occurring on the port side near the engineering spaces, the explosions so powerful that survivors described the ship lifting bodily from the water before settling back with catastrophic flooding that doomed the vessel within minutes. The crew abandoning ship in darkness, while knowing that Japanese destroyers were somewhere nearby and might return to finish off survivors with gunfire. The cruiser rolling over and sinking at 03:04 hours, taking 58 sailors with it, while 773 survivors were rescued by American destroyers that risked their own safety by stopping to pick up swimmers during active combat operations. USS Minneapolis was hit by 2 Type 93 torpedoes forward, the explosions blowing off the bow section completely, severing the forward 36 meters of the ship, which sank immediately, taking the forward turrets and their crews, leaving the cruiser helpless and on fire, but somehow remaining afloat through extraordinary damage control work that contained flooding and stabilized the ship enough that it could be towed to safety, eventually repaired, and returned to service. Though the repairs required 7 months and demonstrated the Type 93's devastating power that could destroy the entire forward section of a heavy cruiser with 2 hits. USS New Orleans was hit by 1 Type 93 amidships, the explosion breaking the ship's back and causing the bow section to twist grotesquely before tearing free and sinking, leaving the cruiser with its forward 45 meters gone, its crew fighting fires and flooding while Japanese destroyers withdrew into darkness, the ship somehow surviving through heroic damage control and being towed to repair facilities where reconstruction took nearly a year and required essentially rebuilding the entire forward half of the cruiser. USS Pensacola was hit by 1 Type 93 aft, the explosion destroying the after-engine room and starting fires in the ammunition handling spaces that threatened to detonate the magazines until crew members flooded them deliberately, sacrificing propulsion to prevent catastrophic explosion, the ship limping back to port with 125 casualties and damage so severe that repairs required 5 months in dry dock. Admiral Carlton Wright, commanding the American force at Tassafaronga, reported, "Enemy destroyers launched torpedoes from estimated range of 20,000 meters, far beyond the effective range of our own weapons. The torpedoes ran true to their targets with devastating effect. Our cruisers were hit before they could engage the enemy with gunfire. The Japanese torpedo superiority creates tactical disadvantage that is difficult to overcome through numerical superiority or tactical skill. We are fighting an enemy whose weapon technology exceeds our own in critical areas, and our doctrine has not adapted to this reality." The frank admission from a flag officer that American weapons were inferior represented institutional recognition that the pre-war assumptions about Japanese capabilities were wrong, that the mockery of Japanese engineering had been arrogant dismissal of competent work, that the toy torpedo, as some American ordnance officers had dismissively called the Type 93 concept, was actually the most effective naval torpedo deployed by any combatant during the war, that Japanese engineers had achieved what American engineers had declared impossible because Japanese engineers had been willing to accept risks that American conservatism had rejected. American efforts to develop equivalent long-range torpedoes began in late 1942, but encountered the same safety challenges that had caused the U.S. Bureau of Ordnance to abandon oxygen torpedo development in 1931, encountered institutional resistance from engineers who insisted that oxygen systems were too dangerous for operational use, encountered procurement delays and testing failures and budget constraints that meant American oxygen torpedoes didn't reach fleet service until 1945, too late to affect the war's outcome, too late to give American surface ships the capability that Japanese forces had possessed since 1933. The delay in American development validated the decision that Asakuma had made in the early 1930s to pursue oxygen torpedoes, despite American advice that they were impractical, validated the Japanese willingness to accept technical risks that Americans considered unacceptable, validated the strategy of achieving tactical advantage through weapons development that exploited American conservatism, and institutional caution that prevented American forces from fielding capabilities that Japanese forces deployed operationally. By 1944, when American industrial superiority had produced overwhelming numerical advantages that made Japanese tactical capabilities increasingly irrelevant, when American submarines and aircraft had largely eliminated Japanese surface forces as effective combat power, when the Type 93's superiority no longer mattered because the ships that launched them were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, American technical analysis of captured Type 93 torpedoes revealed the elegant engineering that had achieved the performance that American engineers had declared impossible. One U.S. Navy technical report examining captured Type 93 specimens stated, "The Japanese Type 93 torpedo represents sophisticated engineering solution to oxygen handling challenges that we believed were insurmountable. The combustion chamber design prevents flashback through multiple redundant systems. The oxygen storage flask uses materials that resist oxidation under high pressure. The maintenance procedures are comprehensive and effective at preventing spontaneous ignition. The weapon is not unsafe if properly handled. Our assessment that oxygen torpedoes were too dangerous for operational use was incorrect. The Japanese engineers solved the safety problems that we assumed were unsolvable. This represents significant achievement that we failed to anticipate or credit to Japanese engineering capabilities." This post-war technical assessment, written with the calm objectivity of engineers examining recovered hardware rather than the emotional intensity of commanders watching their ships explode under torpedo attack, captured the essential reality that American mockery of Japanese torpedo technology had been wrong, that the toy had been deadly effective, that Japanese engineering had been competent and innovative, and willing to accept risks that American conservatism had deemed unacceptable, that the assumption of Western technical superiority had been arrogant rather than accurate. Asakuma survived the war, surrendered to American occupation forces in August 1945, provided technical briefings on Type 93 development to U.S. Navy intelligence officers who were simultaneously impressed by the engineering achievement and appalled by the casualties the weapon had inflicted on American forces, who treated Asakuma with professional respect that contrasted sharply with the pre-war condescension that had characterized American engineers' interactions with their Japanese counterparts. In a 1946 interview conducted by American Technical Intelligence, Asakuma was asked whether he had known during development that American engineers considered oxygen torpedoes impractical. He responded, "Yes, we knew American opinion. We read your technical assessments stating oxygen systems were too dangerous. We knew you had abandoned development because of safety concerns. This knowledge gave us confidence that if we solved the safety problems, we would possess weapons you didn't believe could exist. Your engineers were correct that oxygen torpedoes are dangerous, but danger can be managed through careful engineering and proper procedures. You chose safety over performance. We chose performance despite danger. The result was that we had effective weapons, and you did not, at least not until your industrial capacity overwhelmed our tactical advantages." This assessment captured the essential difference in engineering philosophy that had given Japan temporary tactical superiority, the difference between American conservatism that avoided risks and Japanese pragmatism that accepted risks when the potential benefits justified the dangers, the difference that had allowed Japanese engineers to achieve capabilities that American engineers had declared impossible. Not because they were technically impossible, but because American institutional culture was unwilling to accept the operational risks that Japanese culture considered acceptable in pursuit of tactical advantage. The interview concluded with the American officer asking whether Asakuma felt responsible for American casualties caused by his torpedo. Asakuma paused before responding. "I designed a weapon. I made it as effective as possible. That was my job as naval engineer. Your sailors died because your commanders didn't understand what we had built, because your intelligence dismissed our capabilities as inferior, because your doctrine assumed we couldn't achieve what we actually achieved. The responsibility for casualties belongs to those who made assumptions rather than to those who built weapons that contradicted those assumptions. If your engineers had taken our work seriously, if your intelligence had credited us with competence rather than dismissing us as inferior, your commanders would have prepared for long-range torpedo attacks, and fewer of your sailors would have died." This response, delivered without emotion or apparent concern for how American officers might receive it, represented Japanese perspective on the technological competition that had given them temporary advantage, the perspective that American racism and cultural arrogance had contributed to intelligence failures that caused American casualties, that the mockery of Japanese engineering as inferior had been both wrong and deadly, that the toy torpedo that American ordnance officers had dismissed as impractical fantasy had actually been a sophisticated weapon that American forces weren't prepared to counter because American assumptions had prevented realistic threat assessment. The Type 93 remained in historical memory as example of how underestimating enemies creates vulnerabilities, how cultural assumptions about technical capabilities can be dangerously wrong, how mockery of engineering work based on assumptions rather than analysis leads to surprise when reality contradicts comfortable certainties. The torpedo that American engineers had declared impossible, that American intelligence had dismissed as inferior, that American commanders had not prepared to counter, had shocked the American Navy by demonstrating that Japanese engineering was not only competent but superior in critical areas, had inflicted casualties that might have been avoided if American institutions had taken Japanese capabilities seriously rather than dismissing them as second-rate imitations of Western technology. The lessons were partially learned after Savo Island forced recognition that Japanese weapons exceeded American expectations. But the fundamental pattern, assuming enemy capabilities are inferior without rigorous analysis, dismissing engineering achievements that seem inconsistent with stereotypes about enemy technical competence, allowing cultural arrogance to substitute for realistic threat assessment, remained operational throughout the war and in subsequent conflicts where American forces repeatedly encountered enemies whose capabilities exceeded intelligence estimates because analysts couldn't imagine that less industrialized nations could achieve sophisticated technical results. The Type 93 demonstrated that sophisticated engineering is not monopoly of Western nations, that competent engineers can solve problems that other competent engineers declare unsolvable if different institutional cultures allow different risk tolerance, that mockery of enemy capabilities is poor substitute for rigorous technical analysis, that underestimation creates tactical surprise that kills people who die because their commanders believed comfortable assumptions rather than preparing for uncomfortable possibilities. What shocked Americans about the Type 93 was not ultimately the technical achievement. American engineers examining captured specimens acknowledged it was good work, but not miraculous, difficult, but not impossible, sophisticated but within reach of competent engineering teams with adequate resources. What shocked Americans was that they had been shocked was that Japanese engineers had achieved something that American engineers had declared impractical, was that the institutional assumption of Western technical superiority had been wrong in ways that caused thousands of casualties before reality forced correction of the assumptions that should never have been made in the first place. The toy that wasn't a toy, the weapon that American experts had dismissed as fantasy, the torpedo that Japanese engineers built while American engineers explained why it couldn't be built. That weapon killed American sailors and shocked American commanders and forced American institutions to recognize that mockery based on cultural stereotypes was poor foundation for threat assessment, that sometimes the underestimated enemy achieves what the overconfident observer declares impossible, that being wrong about enemy capabilities is expensive when measured in ships sunk and lives lost, and battles fought at disadvantage because doctrine assumed advantages that didn't exist and ignored threats that were real. That was the legacy of the Type 93, the weapon that was mocked before it was understood, that was deadly because it was dismissed, that shocked the American Navy not through any particular technical brilliance, but through the simple fact that it existed and worked when American assumptions said it couldn't and shouldn't and wouldn't, when comfort was more persuasive than evidence and stereotypes were more convincing than analysis, and mockery was easier than taking Japanese engineering seriously enough to prepare for capabilities that seemed unlikely, but which proved devastatingly real when torpedoes started striking hulls, and ships started sinking, and sailors started dying in battles. They lost because their side had been wrong about what the enemy could build and deploy and use effectively against forces that hadn't prepared for threats. They'd dismissed as impossible toys that turned out to be deadly weapons built by competent engineers who solved problems that other engineers had declared unsolvable.